Mm, boom. I think we're live. Eric, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Could you let the audience know your personal story and the vision and mission of Cellen Health?
Sure. So let me start with the mission of Cellen Health. And so we set up the business in January 2019 to really address two main issues that we saw in the marketplace specifically for treating patients with unmet clinical needs with medical cannabis. Okay, and the two main issues after the legalization in November 2018 was really twofold. The first was the way that the legislation has been written is that effectively only specialist clinicians within their narrow field of specialty are allowed to prescribe medical cannabis. And on top of that, they have to demonstrate, some knowledge about the medicine itself. So basically, the issue there is that you only had about 20 to 25 prescribing clinicians in the UK. But the population set where this can be used as a therapeutic is of course much larger. So what we're looking at doing there is really providing patient access and allowing for patients to actually access the medication without the enormous hurdles which still exist in the marketplace today.
Yeah.
So our mission has very much been in allowing for that sort of for that patient access to medical cannabis. My personal story is I worked in finance for about 12 years. I met my co-founder Benjamin through mutual friends. And I think we just, it just clicked straight away in terms of we just saw that, within the marketplace in the UK, there weren't many, if we start with it, there weren't many companies that were domestic that were sort of looking at this from a UK perspective. A lot of the other companies were either coming in from North America or from Australia or where have you, but they weren't responding to the nuances within the UK market, and that's where we saw a gap and opportunity to set up the company. And then Benjamin, of course, he's his background is very relevant. I mean, he's a NHS consultant, so he understands the sort of the healthcare field a lot better. So we started discussing the topic, and it took us about 6 months before we really found the sort of the area which we wanted to focus on and how to go about building a company around that. So that's how we got going.
Yeah, I mean, what was there a shift that kind of made you go into this type of field? Coming from a finance background, I mean, it's completely understandable wanting to leave the finance sector, but I mean, was there any personal circumstance or like an epiphany that kind of made you realize you didn't want to be in there anymore?
Yeah, there certainly was. I mean, I come from a family of entrepreneurs, and finance was a fantastic school for some years, but I felt that it just lacked purpose in the end. So for me personally, I felt that I wanted something that had some real tangible outputs and outcomes. It was just a matter of time. I was exploring various different ideas, but I didn't feel like I had stumbled upon or come across anything that was quite as purposeful and meaningful as this. And of course, the journey isn't entirely easy, and it's not something that happens overnight. I think it takes a bit of time and thinking, and it's more process that takes you about. In my case, probably it took me a year and a half before we actually sort of did it. So yeah, it's a process rather than an epiphany, is what I'd say.
Yeah. In terms of medical cannabis, could you give us an overview of the regulation that exists around it right now? I mean, from my understanding, it was legalized in 2018,
Mhm.
and you mentioned only specific people can actually prescribe medical cannabis. I mean, which seems
Yeah.
like a massive, massive hurdle.
Yeah, it certainly is. So, in a nutshell, the medical cannabis was rescheduled to schedule what is known as a Schedule 2 drug in the UK in November 2018. What that effectively means is that for patients that have a pre-existing condition and they have a diagnosis, for I think there's about 10 pathologies, and those can be found online. The easiest is actually to go to Project 2021. Their website has a ton of material around this, but effectively, what the process, what needs to happen is a patient needs to have a pre-existing condition where they have a diagnosis for it. Medical cannabis is still treated as a medicine of last resort. So that means that you've had to have tried other therapeutics before, other forms of medication, uh, which haven't proven successful. And in that instance, you can go and see a specialist clinician, and those specialists have the choice to prescribe medical cannabis. It's even more complicated than that because currently it's actually not funded by the NHS, so it is all out of pocket for patients, which is a tremendous hurdle as well, because often these medications can cost several £100. In some instances, we've seen patients that have pay over £1,000 a month to have access to the medication. So that's the process today, and that's where we stand from a legal perspective and a regulatory perspective. The industry has put out, or the industry stakeholders, the NHS, the Public Health England, etc., put out calls for further research into the efficacy and safety of medical cannabis, which is where we're focused a lot today. Is trying to provide the adequate data and research in order for this to go down the route of being available for patients through the NHS. But of course, that is a process, again, which isn't done overnight. It takes time. And one of the initiatives we have there is a project called Project 2021, which has its objective to treat 20,000 patients over the course of until the end of year 2021. And the purpose of that is to gather what will be Europe's largest single database of data, measuring, again, the safety and efficacy of this. And we hope that will be the catalyst and trigger point to start to have these conversations with the public healthcare system, so this becomes more widely available.
I mean, as a company, I mean, what does your business model look like? And like, do customers come directly to you? I mean, and as you answer this, I mean, could you kind of tie in, how your supply chain works and how you kind of fulfill customer orders? Because that's really interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we noticed when setting up the company is that one of the most important aspects is the ability to have consistent supply, which also adheres to the pharmaceutical legislation. So let me back up a little bit. It's interesting if you look at how medical cannabis has come about in different jurisdictions. So if you look at North America, and particularly if you look at a market like Canada, it hasn't come through a pharmaceutical lens. So cannabis has its own legislation body in its entirety, and it's basically almost come from the legalization of a recreational product rather than being pharmaceutical in nature. In Europe, the approach has been entirely different. So in order for this to be treated as a medicine, we have to adhere to all the pharmaceutical legislations. And in Europe, that's in particular, that's known as being EU GMP, so good manufacturing processes, has to be EU GDP, the crops have to be grown in a certain way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was one of the key challenges, is just getting access to those medications into the UK. So we spent the better part of a year actually procuring what we think is a best-in-class supply chain. And what we're actually doing is we're working with contract manufacturers in the UK to provide and produce formulations and products within the UK. And the key advantage that has is a couple of things. The first is we reduce the lead time for actually producing the medicine. So for us, in our partnership structure, it takes about 72 hours versus if you're trying to import the product elsewhere, it can take up to several months to get the products in. The second key advantage that we have is we can do bespoke and tailored medications. So, because it operates very much like a just-in-time manufacturing process, if we have a patient or there's a patient that comes that needs a bespoke type of medication, it's fairly easy for us to manufacture that with our partners, which is of course very different if you have an import and distribution model. So that's one of our main focuses today is to ensure that supply chain works smoothly and we are able to dispense or the products are dispensed appropriately to patients. So that's how we work today.
Do you anticipate? Do you think eventually you'll end up vertically integrating your model? So like growing and growing some of your medicine here in the UK?
So currently, we don't have any plans to do that, and I'd actually say that we have, on purpose, not vertically integrated yet. And many people ask the question, why don't we want to do that quite yet? And the answer is that, well, first of all, because there's so much innovation that's taking place and so many different projects that are popping up now, and investment going into different projects throughout that supply chain and throughout that whole value chain, it's very difficult to be best in class, right? And so we'd much rather work with partners that are the best at what they do, and that way we can deliver a premium product or the best product to patients. Going down a vertically integrated route is, at this point in time, is very difficult, and there's an enormous amount of capital investment that would need to go into doing that. So for us, it's been more important to provide access, to be quick and work directly with the sort of front end of the market to really understand what the patient needs are, to really understand from the clinicians what it is that they need. And then we have a partnership structure that we utilize. Then, of course, in a couple of years, we might look at vertically integrated, but that would more depend on actually being able to work with, again, as I said, for us, it's very important to be working with the best-in-class producers, the product delivery with the best products, the best delivery mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been our model, and others approach it differently, but for us, that's what's worked best so far. So,
yeah, I mean, how do customers interact with you? I mean, there's a lot of people that are, self-medicating with cannabis here in the UK. I mean, the last time I checked, it was something around 1 million. I mean, please correct me on that if I'm wrong. But I mean, how do customers interact with you, and how does that process work? Just given the fact there's so few people being able to prescribe this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so for us, the customers are the prescribing clinicians, so the doctors that are actually prescribing the medications themselves. So we interact with them, I'd say, through 2 or 3 different forums. The first one, and the most obvious one, is through the Project 2021, which is the large registry and trial that I mentioned. And that is a fairly easy interaction process because all the clinicians are sort of They join the project, they register that they want to join the project, and then they have a sort of an educational process that they go through, and we bring them through a process where we set them up and are ready to prescribe. The second is through private clinics. So there we interact with the specialists that often reach out to us. As a result of having limited availability to product in the UK and our ability to have sort of bespoke and tailored medications, they tend to find us.
Yeah.
And the third and the interesting one is the one you mentioned, which is a large part of patients that reach out to us directly. So more sort of on a reverse inquiry basis, where we'll consistently find, or we often have patients that have either tried some other medication that doesn't work, or they've been self-medicating for a long time. And it's important to know that the patients are actually they're highly organized, and they're very educated on the subject. And it's interesting because in this sector, the ones that are really driving this sector forward the most are actually the patient groups. They're the ones that have been the most vocal in terms of lobbying, the ones that have been most vocal in terms of, changing the legislation. And so, of course, that is a very important touch point for us, is to have an understanding and a relationship with those patients and those patient groups. And as I mentioned, it's critical for an early business like us to really understand what it is that they expect from the treatment plans.
But were there elements of were there models globally that you guys look to kind of emulate and kind of copy? From my limited understanding about this sector, I think it was Israel that's leading and was one of the first countries to provide cannabis as medicine. Were there regulations or models that you've you would like to emulate from different countries and kind of apply it to your own business?
Yeah. So I think maybe a statement to begin with, but the UK is still very much an emerging market when it comes to this space, right? So there's certainly lessons that we can draw from other jurisdictions. When it comes to sort of who are the experts from a clinical perspective, you're absolutely right. We draw a lot from researchers and clinicians from Israel. So we actually have a professor by the Professor of Dr. Haggai Sharon, who is from Israel, and he is a neuropathic pain specialist, and he is part of our. He sits on our clinical board. But as I mentioned, the UK market is very different. It's much more cautious. It's much more data driven. It's much more research driven, and it looks at this from a pharmaceutical lens. So we've had to take pockets of what we think are best practices elsewhere and are trying to adapt them to the UK market. And a couple of very simple examples to that is in the UK, prescriptions can only be made out for 28 days or 1 month, right? So therefore, that whole process of how you interact with patients, what type of bottle sizes and medications you can give out to patients, they have to be adapted to the UK market. You can't just take something that's worked in North America and try and push it here, or that's worked in somewhere another jurisdiction and push it here, right? You have to adapt. But one of the things, if we look at more closer to home, then if we look at sort of in the European context, the two markets that are more advanced, I should say, are the German market and the Danish market. So we have partners in both places where we draw from them in terms of how to build the business around here, right? So another example I can give you there is one of the interesting models that has worked in Denmark has been the one that I described as sort of the compounding business, where you actually have you tap into the existing pharmaceutical infrastructure, where you have specials manufacturers or compounders that have expertise in actually making the final products, instead of trying to do it your own, right? So that's a model that we took from Denmark, which works very well here. So yeah, so that's how we've gone about it.
I mean, what's the price differential between, you know, what like, I guess the right question would be, what's the price differential between what people were paying, say, pre-2018, and now, you know, where they can get it from, you know, a couple of certified specialists and yourself. I mean, for a parent, it must be really, it must be really relieving, actually, not having to travel to the Netherlands to get medicine for their kid that has, you know, a certain condition.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what's been the customer sentiment, and what's also been the price differential, you know, now and, you know, pre-2018?
Yeah. So it's a very good question. So pre-2018, and even after, you know, after the legislation, there was a large part of the patient groups that unfortunately still had to travel to places like Holland to get their medication, right? So if we just exclude the travel costs, and not even that, even all the sort of societal costs with having to travel to the Netherlands, right? So you'd have to take into account having to take time off work, you know, just the whole package around that. If we just exclude that, we just look at the cost of the pure medication. You know, in certain instances, I think we can quite firmly say that the prices have come down by about 50%. Okay.
Wow. Yeah.
But we still have some a way to go, because it's still not a quote unquote cheap medication, and because it's still all privately funded, or it's still all out of pocket, it's still cost is still a big hurdle, right?
Yeah.
And that is, I think, the challenge that we have as an industry, is to provide that data, right? So we can actually prove that it's effective, it's safe, that there is a cost benefit to being able to provide this vis-a-vis other forms of medication, or whether it's on unmet clinical needs via the NHS. So that's where we stand from a price point today. I'd say we are getting close in the UK to what the medicines cost in, for example, Germany. But the big difference there now in Germany is that you have the insurance scheme, or the state insurance scheme, which covers a large part of the medication. So, you know, that's where we've seen in Germany, there's been a pretty big takeoff in terms of the utilization of it. And we think a large part of that is because it's available now for patients through the sort of government insurance schemes.
I mean, could you talk a bit more about the personalization of your medicine? And apologies in advance. I just struggle to get my head around that, because normally if you've got you know, problems with yourself, I don't know, you may have, I don't know, stomach issues, or you might have like you might have arthritis. You know, there's different medicine for that, different compounds, different things that go into that medicine. Now, from my understanding, there's CBD and THC. Now, where does the personalization come into it? Because different people, I mean, I'm struggling to come up with a question, but yeah.
I understand what you're saying. The personalization, effectively, in its simplest form, comes into how concentrated or how much of THC and CBD you would consume. So, and the examples are depending on, you know, how you, you know, what pathology you have, you know, you as an individual, how you respond to the medication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we're able to do is to provide you with a higher concentrated CBD product, or a higher THC concentrated product, or a blend there, in a blend in between. And that will then, what we can do is, depending on if you are, you know, suffering from, let's take, you know, chronic pain, and you might be, 70 years old, and you've tried all sorts of medication before, and et cetera, et cetera. What works for you might be very different from, let's say, a patient that suffers from epilepsy, where they would just have a very different concentration of CBD in this instance. So what we're able to do is effectively work with those two compounds, CBD and THC, and provide different concentration levels for patients, depending on how they respond and what conditions they have, and etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely does make sense. And probably the Project 21 will provide you with deeper data. You'll be able to get in a stronger data packet and be able to be a little bit more precise on what ratios will kind of help what condition, right?
That's exactly it. So the long-term goal from this is to gather that data so we get the more accurate sort of dosing, and that we can then translate into a more effective production cycle and more effective manufacturing cycle. So that we effectively not only do the adequate research, so we start to understand what works in different patient groups, but we can also act on it to do predictive analysis on what would work if we have new patients that come in with new with new conditions.
I mean, going slightly away from the medical cannabis, I mean, as a business, how has COVID affected you guys, and how have you had to adjust some of your business operations and your model? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So the first thing we noticed was that there was a disruption in a lot of our I should say competitors' supply chains, although I don't really, they have slightly different products. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies that are bringing products in from outside of the UK, they struggled throughout the beginning of COVID to actually bring products in for a variety of reasons. But that was certainly disruption in their supply chain. We didn't experience that disruption because, as I mentioned, we already have the ability to manufacture within the UK. So we could actually, and we did actually have a production throughout the whole peak of the pandemic. The second effect that we saw was that a lot of the specialist clinicians were actually called back into the front line. So a lot of the chronic conditions that we were looking at, they were unfortunately neglected, I think is the right word, as we all went back into sort of fighting the front line of COVID. And so we did see, or we still have a backlog of patients that we need to get through, where we're, those clinicians are now coming back online to treat those patients. But we saw that, the prescriber uptake was a lot lower throughout the peak of the pandemic. And then the most obvious shift, which is of course the one where, the healthcare system has just gone digital, right? So prior to COVID, these clinics were effectively brick and mortar clinics, and just seeing a clinician was you went to a physical clinic. That has shifted, and what would be interesting to see now is how does the CQC and how does the regulatory bodies adapt these new digital technologies going forward as well, because a lot of them have been operating on exemptions, but has the shift now proven to be safe enough that we start to have a system which is much more digital also in the sort of new normal and in the long term. But those are sort of the three main impacts that we've seen so far. And then of course we're not quite out of this yet, so we'll see what else will come along. But
in a uber optimistic world, 18 months from now, what do you hope to have achieved as a business, and more specifically the access and the service you're able to provide people with chronic conditions?
So I think the most important milestone or KPI that we have is just to ensure that patients receive medication. So we actually track, that's one of our main KPIs, is how many patients are receiving medications that come through the supply chain that we've built, right? And the market in the UK today is still small. It's still, my best guess is this between 500 and 800 patients, and I think that's a pretty accurate guesstimate. But I would like to, in 18 months, I'd like to see that number to be closer to sort of 20,000. And all our efforts are really right now into focusing on building not only our business but building the market as we do so, because there isn't any infrastructure in place, right? So we have to do a lot of market development work. So as a business, of course, we have our KPIs on how many patients we'd like to serve, but I think I think we're well positioned should the market start to grow to be able to be a significant portion of that. The second thing that I really think we need to start to focus on as an industry is the research component. So we have a lot of different research initiatives that we're working with various partners on. But in 18 months, I think we should be we should be able to provide some of the answers to some of these questions that have been posed by the sort of the bigger healthcare community around understanding how this works in the UK better than what we do today. So those are some of the goals that we as well that we're working towards as well.
Yeah. Final question. What do you think you need to build and prove in order to be able to stand a chance of being able to offer this through the NHS? And what realistic regulatory barrier what realistic regulatory barriers need to be tweaked in order to be able to even stand a chance of being able to offer this through the NHS?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I think it has to be research driven. I don't expect that we would have, as an industry, a chance unless we answer those calls for research that have been issued, and that is why I think it's so important to engage more in doing the research. And as I mentioned, Project 2021 is a starting point, and it's a catalyst, we believe, to being able to engage and have those conversations. But there's no doubt that we need to have we need to work on the research front as Cellen, but also just as an industry. So that is the barrier. I think in terms of being able to supply, in being able to, provide and educate and all of that, I think are sort of the problems that are solvable. It's the research side, which more work needs to be done.
Interesting. As we're embarking towards the end of the interview, I mean, is there anything you kind of need to shout out? Are you guys looking for investment? Are you guys hiring? Yeah. Where can people find you?
Yeah, no, so you can find us on cellenhealth.com. I think, my final sort of shout outs and thoughts would be that, if you are interested in this space, be that if you're a researcher, if you're a patient, if you're an interested clinician, it's just to reach out to us. I think, for us, it's been one of the lessons learned is that, in this sector, we really need to collaborate as much as possible. And that is for patient benefit. And so if you're interested, please reach out. We very much value working in partnerships and collaboration. Me on eric@cellenhealth.com, or just visit our website and contact us that way.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being on the show this morning. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.